Look at this photograph. Chicago, 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition. What you're seeing is supposed to be temporary construction, built in less than 2 years by workers using hand tools and horse-drawn carts. Over 200 buildings. Neoclassical architecture so intricate, so mathematically precise, that modern engineers scratch their heads trying to figure out how it was done with the technology of that era. Now look closer. Those aren't simple structures. We're talking about massive domed buildings with ornate facades, classical columns that reach dozens of feet into the sky, sculptures so detailed they look like they took lifetimes to carve. The official story says thousands of workers constructed this entire white city in 24 months, then tore it all down and burned it after the fair ended. Does that make sense to you? Because here's what doesn't add up. In 1891, before construction supposedly began, Chicago was still recovering from the Great Fire of 1871. The city had dirt roads in many areas. Electricity was barely becoming a thing. The common worker used hammers, saws, and manual labor. No power tools, no cranes like we have today, no computer modeling, no modern concrete mixers. Yet somehow, in this time period, they built structures that rival anything we could build today. And they did it faster than we could do it now, with all our modern technology. The transportation building alone had a doorway called the Golden Door, covered in gold leaf and intricate geometric patterns that would take skilled craftsmen months to complete by hand. They supposedly built it in weeks. And Chicago wasn't alone. Look at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, the San Francisco Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, Paris, London, Melbourne. Every major city that hosted a World's Fair in the late 1800s and early 1900s tells the same impossible story. Massive, ornate, classically designed buildings that appeared almost overnight, only to be demolished or mysteriously burned down shortly after. But here's where it gets really strange. Look at photographs of these cities before the fairs were announced. In many cases, the buildings are already there, not under construction, already standing. The official narrative says these photos don't exist or are mislabeled, but researchers have found dozens of them in archives. Buildings that were supposedly built for the fair, photographed years before the fair was even planned. Take the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, built for the 1915 exposition, or so they say. It's one of the few structures that wasn't demolished after the fair. Today, it's considered one of the most beautiful examples of Roman and Greek architecture in America. The official story is that it was designed by architect Bernard Maybeck and constructed specifically for the fair. But if you look at the construction photos, something feels off. The building looks weathered in images from 1915, as if it had been standing for decades, not months. Now, let's talk about the technology. These buildings had features that shouldn't have existed yet. Advanced electrical systems, hydraulic elevators, massive glass domes that would be challenging to construct even today. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building at the Chicago Fair was the largest building in the world at that time. It covered over 44 acres under a single roof. Think about that. 44 acres, one roof, built in 1892. Modern engineers have tried to recreate the construction process using the tools and methods that would have been available in that era. They can't do it. Not in 2 years. Not in 5 years. The mathematics don't work. The timeline doesn't work. The available workforce doesn't work. Yet there the buildings stood, captured in thousands of photographs, visited by millions of people. And here's what makes people really start asking questions. After these magnificent fairs ended, after millions of people had walked through these architectural marvels, they were destroyed, not repurposed, not converted into museums or civic buildings, destroyed, burned, torn down. The official explanation is that they were always meant to be temporary, built with staff, a type of plaster that wasn't meant to last. But look at the photographs. Those buildings have stone foundations, metal frameworks, glass and steel. They're not movie sets. They're not made of plaster and wood. They're real buildings. Why would anyone invest millions of dollars, equivalent to billions today, to build something so magnificent just to destroy it a few months later? It's like building a palace and then setting it on fire, because you only needed it for a party. It makes no economic sense. It makes no logical sense. Unless, and this is where we step into controversial territory, unless those buildings weren't built for the fairs at all. Unless they were already there, inherited from something that came before, from a civilization that we've been told doesn't exist. Unless the world's fairs weren't celebrations of modern progress, but rather elaborate cover stories for why these impossible buildings existed in the first place. Look at the architecture itself. Every single one of these World's Fair buildings follows the same design principles: neoclassical, Greek revival, Roman influence, massive columns, perfect symmetry, intricate mathematical proportions. And here's the kicker. This style appears all over the world in buildings from the same era: courthouses, libraries, train stations, government buildings, banks, all built in the late 1800s, all following the same architectural language, all supposedly constructed by different architects in different countries who somehow all decided to build in identical styles. The consistency is eerie. It's as if someone was working from the same blueprint, the same template, the same architectural knowledge that spanned continents. Buildings in Moscow look like buildings in Washington. Structures in Melbourne mirror designs in Montreal. It's not just similar, it's identical in its principles and execution. Now, before we go further, I want to take a moment here. If you're finding this interesting, if these questions are making you think about history in a different way, consider subscribing to the channel. We dig deep into these mysteries that mainstream sources won't touch. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what we uncover next, because what we're about to explore gets even stranger. Trust me, you'll want to see where this rabbit hole goes. So back to these impossible buildings. There's another detail that doesn't get talked about much. Many of these structures have features that suggest they were designed for purposes we don't quite understand. Take the domes, for example. Massive copper domes, often covered in gold leaf, sitting atop these buildings like crowns. The official explanation is that they're decorative, symbolic of enlightenment and progress. But researchers have noticed something interesting. These domes are almost always connected to metal framework that runs through the entire building, metal that conducts electricity. In fact, many of these old buildings have metal spires, ornate metalwork that runs along the roof and down through the structure. If you were an engineer designing a building to harness atmospheric electricity, to pull energy from the air itself, you'd design it exactly like these old World's Fair buildings. Tall, conductive materials, geometric precision, domed tops that could act as resonance chambers. And this is where the story connects to names you might know. Nikola Tesla was alive during this period. He was experimenting with wireless energy transmission, with pulling electricity from the atmosphere, with technology that he claimed could power entire cities without wires. His work was mysteriously shut down. His funding disappeared. His papers were confiscated after his death. And conveniently, the World's Fairs stopped happening in the same grand style shortly after Tesla's experiments were suppressed. Coincidence? Maybe. But look at the timeline. Look at the buildings. Look at what was destroyed and what was kept. The buildings that survived, that weren't burned or demolished, had their interiors gutted and redesigned. Their electrical systems were removed or covered up. Their original purposes were erased and replaced with modern convention centers or museums. Whatever these buildings were originally designed to do, we're not doing it anymore. Here's a question that should bother everyone. If we had the ability to build structures this magnificent in the 1890s, why don't our modern buildings look anything like them? Why did architecture take such a dramatic turn towards simple, boxy, utilitarian designs in the 20th century? The excuse is that modern architecture is more practical, more cost-effective. But is it? Or did we lose something? Did we lose knowledge, technique, understanding of principles that our ancestors somehow possessed? The World's Fairs represent a breaking point in history. Before them, we see these incredible structures attributed to various architects and builders, all working in the same style. After them, architecture changes. It simplifies. It becomes less ornate, less ambitious, less connected to the classical principles that had dominated for centuries. Something shifted. Something changed, and the official explanation, that we simply moved on to new styles, feels insufficient when you look at what was lost, because we can't build like that anymore. Not easily, not quickly, not with the same level of detail and precision. Modern attempts to recreate classical architecture require years of work, teams of specialized craftsmen, and budgets that make the projects nearly impossible. Yet we're supposed to believe that in 1892, with hand tools and manual labor, workers built an entire city of these structures in less than 2 years, then burned it down. The buildings that don't make sense aren't just architectural curiosities. They're evidence. Evidence of a timeline that doesn't quite fit the story we've been told. Evidence of capabilities that exceed what should have been possible. Evidence of a past that might have been far more advanced, far more connected, far more extraordinary than history books want to admit. And the world's fairs might not have been celebrations of human achievement, but rather the last public display of an inherited world before it was deliberately erased and replaced with a new narrative, a new history, a new explanation for where all these impossible buildings came from. So when you look at these photographs, when you see these magnificent structures that appeared and disappeared like dreams, ask yourself the question that nobody wants you to ask. What if they didn't build these buildings? What if they found them? Now let's talk about something that's even harder to explain away than the buildings. Let's talk about maps. Not modern maps. Not the ones you pull up on your phone. We're talking about maps from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. Maps created by the most respected cartographers in Europe. Maps published in official atlases, encyclopedias, and geographic surveys. Maps that show something that, according to modern history, never existed. They show Tartaria, not a small region, not a minor territory. We're talking about an empire that, according to these maps, covered the largest landmass on Earth, stretching from the Caspian Sea all the way to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia down through what we now call Central Asia, an area so massive it makes the Roman Empire look like a small neighborhood by comparison. Look at a map from 1700. There it is, labeled clearly, Tartary, Tartaria, Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. The names vary slightly depending on the cartographer, but the territory is always there, always massive, always occupying the heart of Asia. These aren't fringe maps made by conspiracy theorists in their basements. These are official maps, maps used by governments, maps that guided explorers, maps that appeared in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Let me say that again. The Encyclopedia Britannica, the 1771 edition, has an entire entry on Tartary. It describes the geography, the climate, the people. It talks about Tartary as if it's common knowledge, as obvious as France or Spain. The entry doesn't say mythical Tartary or the region some people call Tartary. It just says Tartary, as a fact, as a place that exists. So what happened? How does an empire that covers millions of square miles, that appears on every major map for 300 years, just disappear? Not gradually, not over centuries, but suddenly, by the mid-1800s, the name Tartaria starts vanishing from maps. By 1900, it's gone completely, replaced with Russia, China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, the largest empire on Earth, erased from history in less than 50 years. The official explanation goes something like this. Tartary wasn't a real country or empire. It was just a vague geographic term that Europeans used to describe the vast, unknown regions of Central Asia, a catch-all name for areas they didn't understand. As European knowledge of Asia improved, as they learned the actual names of the regions and peoples, the term Tartary fell out of use. Simple as that. Mystery solved. Except that explanation falls apart when you actually look at the maps, because these cartographers weren't ignorant. They weren't just guessing. Maps from the 1700s show detailed borders. They show cities. They show different types of Tartary, subdivided into specific regions with specific names. These are not vague gestures toward unknown lands. These are detailed geographic representations of a defined territory. And here's something interesting. The maps don't just show Tartary as empty space. They show it as organized, as civilized, as containing cities and infrastructure. The same maps that accurately depict London, Paris, and Rome also show cities in Tartary: Tobolsk, Tomsk, Kazan. These weren't small outposts. According to the maps, these were significant urban centers. Some maps even show Tartary's capital, though historians debate where exactly it was located. Now let's talk about who made these maps. We're not talking about random amateur cartographers. We're talking about the best geographers of their time. Abraham Ortelius, often called the creator of the first modern atlas, showed Tartary on his maps in the late 1500s. John Speed, one of England's most famous mapmakers, published detailed maps of Tartary in 1626. The French Royal Academy of Sciences, probably the most prestigious scientific institution in Europe, published maps showing Tartary throughout the 1700s. These were serious people. Their reputations depended on accuracy. Kings and generals used their maps to plan expeditions and military campaigns. Merchants used them to establish trade routes. If Tartary was just a made-up name for an unknown region, why would these cartographers risk their credibility by drawing detailed borders and marking specific cities? And it wasn't just European maps. Russian maps show Tartary. Chinese maps acknowledge Tartary on their borders. Japanese maps from the Edo period show Tartary to their west. Even American maps, as the United States was being established, show Tartary. A map of the world published in Philadelphia in 1795 clearly labels Tartary across Central Asia. This wasn't European ignorance. This was global consensus. Here's where it gets even more suspicious. When you look at maps chronologically, you can see Tartaria shrinking. Maps from 1600 show it at its largest. By 1700, it's still enormous, but some regions have been relabeled. By 1800, parts of it are being called Russia, parts China. By 1850, it's fragmented into smaller territories. By 1900, it's gone, completely erased. What could cause an empire to disappear from maps that quickly? War? Conquest? Collapse? Sure, empires fall. Rome fell. The Mongol Empire broke apart. But when empires collapse, history remembers them. We have thousands of books about Rome. We know exactly what happened to the Mongols. We can trace every major empire's rise and fall with detailed historical records. But Tartaria? Nothing. No official history of its collapse. No records of a final war. No documentation of its territories being absorbed. It just stops appearing on maps, and historians act like it was never real to begin with. Now, some researchers have noticed something interesting about the timing. Tartaria starts disappearing from maps right around the time that we see the Great Reset theories point to, the mid to late 1800s, the same period when we see the mudflood evidence, the same period when we see cities being razed and rebuilt, the same period when massive classical buildings start appearing everywhere, then getting destroyed at world's fairs. The timeline is suspicious. Let's look at what else was happening during this period. The 1800s were the age of colonialism. European powers were dividing up the world. Britain, France, Spain, Russia, they were all grabbing territory, drawing new borders, establishing new maps that served their interests. And Central Asia, that massive region that used to be called Tartaria, became a target. Russia expanded eastward. China expanded westward. Britain pushed north from India. These powers carved up the land and renamed it. But here's the question. If Tartaria was just empty, uncivilized territory waiting to be colonized, why does it appear on old maps as an organized empire? Why are there descriptions of Tartarian culture, Tartarian cities, Tartarian trade? Marco Polo traveled through these regions in the 1300s and described advanced civilizations. Arab travelers wrote about the wealth and sophistication of Central Asian cities. Were they all lying? Were they all confused? Or was there something there? Something significant enough to put on every map for 300 years? Something that later needed to be erased from history, rewritten, explained away as a geographic misunderstanding? Because if Tartaria was real, if it was an advanced empire that controlled the heart of Asia, then the entire narrative of history needs to be re-examined. Think about what it would mean. An empire that lasted for centuries, possibly longer, with its own culture, its own architecture, its own technology. An empire that, for whatever reason, was systematically removed from historical records. its buildings attributed to other civilizations, its people absorbed into other ethnic groups, its very name erased from maps and textbooks. That's not a small revision, that's a complete rewriting of history. And the evidence isn't hidden in some dusty archive that nobody can access. It's right there in plain sight. Go to any library that has old map collections. Look up atlases from the 1700s. You'll see Tartaria, clear as day. You can find these maps online, in museum collections, in historical societies. The evidence exists. It's just been explained away, dismissed, treated as if it doesn't matter. But it does matter, because maps are evidence of what people knew at the time. When cartographers put Tartaria on their maps, they weren't guessing. They were recording what they understood to be true. And when that name disappears, when an empire that covered millions of square miles just vanishes from human knowledge in less than a century, we should be asking why. We should be asking what happened. We should be asking who benefited from erasing this name, this place, this history. The maps show us something that modern textbooks refuse to acknowledge. They show us a world that was organized differently than we've been taught. They show us an empire that, by all logic, should be as famous as Rome or Egypt, but instead has been scrubbed from collective memory. And when you start connecting these maps to the architecture, to the mudflood evidence, to the technology that seems too advanced for the timeline, a picture starts forming. A picture of a past that's been deliberately obscured, deliberately simplified, deliberately rewritten to fit a narrative that serves the powers that control our understanding of history. Before we go deeper, I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop your location and the time in the comments. I love seeing how this mystery connects people from all corners of the world, at all hours of the day and night. There's something poetic about that. People scattered across the same earth that once belonged to an empire nobody remembers, all searching for the same hidden truth at the same time. So the next time someone tells you Tartaria never existed, show them a map from 1771. Show them the Encyclopedia Britannica entry. Show them the detailed borders drawn by the most respected cartographers in Europe. And ask them the simple question, if it never existed, why is it on every map? Walk through any old city in the world and pay attention to something nobody talks about. The ground level. Not where it is now, but where it used to be. Look at the old buildings. Really look at them. And you'll notice something strange. Windows that are halfway underground. Doors that lead to basements but were clearly designed as main entrances. First floors that are now below street level. Entire stories buried beneath what we consider normal ground. This isn't happening in one place. It's happening everywhere. Seattle, San Francisco, New York, London, Paris, Rome, Moscow, Istanbul. Major cities across every continent have the same phenomenon. Buildings that were constructed at one ground level now sit buried several feet, sometimes 10 or 15 feet, below the current street surface. And the official explanation is always the same. Urban development, street raising, flood prevention, infrastructure improvement. Sounds reasonable until you start looking at the scale. We're not talking about a few buildings in a few cities. We're talking about thousands of structures across the entire world, all showing evidence of the same event. The ground level rose, rapidly, covering first floors, filling in basement windows, burying what were once street-level entrances. And it happened during a very specific time period, the 1800s into the early 1900s. There are photographs, thousands of them, archived images from the late 1800s, showing cities in a state that makes no logical sense. Pictures of workers digging out streets, not building them up, but excavating them, removing layers of soil and debris from between buildings that are already standing. In some photos, you can see buildings with their first floors clearly below the excavation level, as if the earth had risen up around them and workers were trying to dig them back out. Take Seattle. The Seattle Underground is famous now, a tourist attraction where you can walk through the buried first floors of the original city. The official story is straightforward. After the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, city planners decided to raise the street level to prevent flooding from Puget Sound. They built retaining walls, filled in the streets, and created a new ground level 8 to 30 feet above the original. The old sidewalks and storefronts became basements. Simple urban planning. But look at the photographs from that period. Buildings were already standing before the fire. After the fire, instead of clearing the rubble and rebuilding at the same level, they buried the first floors. Why? If flooding was the issue, why not build better drainage? Why not construct seawalls? Why go through the massive expense and effort of literally burying an entire city and building on top of it? And why does this same pattern appear in cities that had no flooding issues at all? Chicago has the same story. After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the city was rebuilt. But if you look at old buildings that survived or were constructed shortly after, their first floors sit well below modern street level. Boston raised its streets in the mid-1800s. So did San Francisco. So did dozens of other American cities, all during the same narrow window of time. All with similar explanations about flooding, sanitation, or urban improvement. Now cross the ocean. London has buried streets. Paris has underground sections where you can see the original first floors of buildings now sitting 12 feet below current ground level. Rome, a city thousands of years old, has layers of civilization built on top of each other, which makes sense given its age. But even Rome has evidence of rapid burial during the 1800s. Excavations show that 19th century buildings were buried much faster than the gradual accumulation of earlier centuries. Moscow, St. Petersburg, Istanbul, Melbourne, Buenos Aires. The list goes on. Every major city shows the same evidence. First floors that became basements. Street level that rose dramatically in a very short period. And everywhere, the same vague explanations. Development, progress, improvement. As if every city on Earth independently decided at the same time to bury their existing structures and start over several feet higher. Here's what makes researchers suspicious. In many cases, the buried floors show no signs of intentional filling. They weren't carefully covered with imported soil and construction materials. They looked like they were flooded with mud and sediment. Thick, dense layers of earth that filled in spaces rapidly, hardening over time. The term for this is mud flood, a wave or multiple waves of liquefied earth that swept across regions, filling in lower levels of buildings, covering streets, leaving only the upper stories exposed. Photographs from the 1800s show cities in transition, buildings standing with massive amounts of dirt piled against them, workers with shovels and carts digging out streets that look like they've been buried under earth flows. And here's the thing, these aren't construction photos, they're excavation photos. The buildings are already there. The workers aren't raising streets, they're uncovering them, trying to restore access to structures that have been partially buried. Look at images from Galveston, Texas, after the hurricane of 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. 6,000 to 12,000 people died. But here's what doesn't get talked about much. After the hurricane, instead of rebuilding at the original level, they razed the entire city, every building. They jacked up structures, some weighing thousands of tons, and filled in beneath them. They raised the grade of the entire island by up to 17 feet. The official reason? Future flood prevention. But Galveston had been there for decades without being raised. Why did the hurricane suddenly necessitate such extreme measures? And why does this same response appear after disasters worldwide? After fires, after floods, after earthquakes, the solution is always the same. Raise the city, bury the first floor, build on top. Never rebuild at the original level. Some researchers have pointed to specific events that might explain a global mud flood. The Carrington event of 1859, a massive solar storm that caused geomagnetic disturbances worldwide. Could such an event trigger seismic activity, volcanic eruptions, atmospheric changes that led to catastrophic mudflows? There's no consensus, but the timing is interesting. The mud flood evidence appears most dramatically after the mid-1800s. Then there are the old photographs that show something even stranger, pictures of cities that look empty. Major urban centers with beautiful classical architecture, wide boulevards, ornate buildings, but no people, or very few people. Images from the late 1800s of places that should have been bustling with activity, but instead look recently abandoned or barely inhabited, as if these cities existed before the current population moved in, as if they were inherited, not built. And connected to this are the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 orphaned or abandoned children were transported from East Coast cities to the American Midwest and West. The official story is that urbanization and immigration created overwhelming numbers of street children who needed homes. But 200,000 children? Where did they all come from? And why during this exact time period when cities are being buried and rebuilt? Some theories suggest a missing generation, that whatever event caused the mud flood also caused massive population loss, that the orphans weren't products of urbanization but survivors of catastrophe, that the empty cities in those photographs were empty because the previous inhabitants were gone, and the orphan trains were part of repopulating the continent. It sounds extreme until you look at the insane asylum records from the same period. Mental institutions were being built everywhere in the late 1800s. Massive facilities that could house thousands of patients. And they were full, overcrowded even. The official explanation is that awareness of mental health improved, leading to more diagnoses and institutionalizations. But the numbers are staggering. Why were so many people suddenly losing their minds? What kind of event could cause mass psychological trauma across multiple continents? There's also the timing of the world's fairs we talked about earlier. They began in earnest after the mid-1800s, after the mud flood period, almost as if they were showcasing inherited buildings, explaining them as modern construction, providing a narrative for why these magnificent structures existed. The fairs happened in cities that show mud flood evidence. Chicago, San Francisco, St. Louis, all had their streets raised, their ground levels altered, their first floors buried during the same era when the world's fairs were happening. The mainstream explanation for all of this is urban development. Cities grew, infrastructure improved, modern sanitation required raising streets, and industrialization allowed for projects that would have been impossible in earlier eras. It's not a conspiracy, it's progress. The buried floors are just the result of necessary civic improvements that happened to occur worldwide during the Industrial Revolution. But that explanation requires accepting an awful lot of coincidences. That every major city independently decided to bury itself. That the timeline of this massive undertaking just happened to align perfectly across continents. That the empty city photographs, the orphan trains, the asylum boom, the world's fairs, and the architectural mysteries all just happened to occur during the same narrow window of history. Or there's another explanation. Something happened. Something global. Something that buried cities under mud and earth. That disrupted civilization enough to leave thousands of children orphaned and thousands of adults traumatized. And in the aftermath, survivors inherited a world of magnificent buildings they couldn't explain, cities they had to dig out and reoccupy, and a history they had to rewrite to make sense of what they found. The evidence is literally under our feet, in every old city, in every buried floor, in every basement window that used to be a first-floor entrance. The ground level tells a story that official history doesn't want to acknowledge. And once you see it, once you notice those half-buried windows and underground doors, you can't unsee it. The past is buried, yes, but not hidden, just ignored. So we've established that Tartaria appears on maps for centuries. We've seen the buildings that don't fit the timeline. We've looked at evidence of cities buried under mud. But here's the question nobody seems able to answer. Who were these people? Who were the Tartarians? This is where things get complicated, because the historical record is surprisingly thin for an empire that supposedly covered a third of Asia. You'd think an empire that massive would have left behind libraries full of documents, detailed chronicles, cultural artifacts that clearly identify who they were and how they lived. But instead, we get fragments, scattered references, descriptions from outsiders, and a whole lot of silence from mainstream academia. Start with what we do have. Western travelers who passed through these regions left accounts. Marco Polo, traveling in the late 1200s, wrote about the lands of the Great Khan, but he also mentioned regions beyond Mongol control, territories inhabited by peoples he called Tartars. He described them as fierce warriors, skilled horsemen, but also as builders of great cities. His accounts suggest these weren't just nomadic tribes. They had permanent settlements, trade networks, organized society. Arab geographers and historians from the medieval period wrote about Central Asian civilizations with advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. They described cities along the Silk Road with universities, libraries, and architectural achievements that rivaled anything in the Islamic world or Europe. Some of these accounts specifically mention Tartary as a distinct region with its own cultural identity, separate from the Mongol Empire, separate from China, separate from Persia. But here's where the confusion starts. The term Tartar or Tartar gets used in different ways by different sources. Sometimes it refers to Mongol warriors. Sometimes it describes Turkish-speaking peoples of Central Asia. Sometimes it seems to be a catch-all term Europeans used for anyone from the eastern steppes. This ambiguity has allowed modern historians to dismiss Tartaria entirely, claiming it was never a specific empire, just a vague geographic label. Yet if you dig deeper, patterns emerge. Multiple sources describe the inhabitants of Tartary as distinct from Mongols, distinct from Chinese, distinct from Russians. They're described as tall, often with European features. Light hair and light eyes appear in several accounts, which is interesting given the region. Some travelers noted that Tartarians had their own language, their own writing system, their own religious practices that blended elements of shamanism, Buddhism, and something else that observers couldn't quite identify. The religious aspect is particularly intriguing. Several European accounts from the 1600s and 1700s mention that Tartarians practiced a form of spirituality that involved energy, vibration, and harmony with natural forces. They built structures aligned with astronomical events. They understood acoustics and used sound in their religious ceremonies. They had knowledge of metallurgy and electricity that seemed advanced for the period. Does any of this sound familiar? It should, because it describes exactly the kind of civilization that would build the architectural marvels we've been discussing. Then there are the giant legends. Multiple cultures across Eurasia have stories about a race of giants who once inhabited Central Asia. Native American tribes have legends about red-haired giants. European folklore speaks of giants in the East. Even the Bible mentions giants, the Nephilim, in regions that roughly correspond to Central Asia. Now, we have to be careful here. Giant legends exist in almost every culture, and most are probably mythological. But the consistency of these stories, specifically tied to the Tartary region, makes researchers wonder if there's something to it. Photographs from the 1800s show skeletons of unusually tall humans excavated from burial mounds in Central Asia and North America. Some of these skeletons reportedly measured 7 to 9 feet tall. The Smithsonian Institution allegedly has records of these finds, though most of the physical evidence has disappeared. Official explanations suggest the measurements were exaggerated, or the skeletons were normal humans with gigantism. But the number of reports, from multiple continents, all describing similar finds, creates a pattern that's hard to dismiss entirely. Whether or not Tartarians were literally giants, accounts consistently describe them as tall, strong, and physically impressive. They were known as warriors, yes, but also as builders, as architects, as people with advanced technical knowledge. The Mongol Empire conquered vast territories in the 1300s, but even Mongol chronicles acknowledge that they absorbed and built upon existing civilizations in Central Asia. They didn't create from nothing. They took over infrastructure, cities, and knowledge that was already there. This raises a critical question. If the Mongol Empire absorbed Tartarian territories, why do we remember the Mongols but not the Tartarians? The answer might be political. The Mongol Empire fragmented into khanates that eventually became part of recognizable modern nations. Russia, China, Persia, Turkey. Each of these powers claimed Mongol heritage as part of their own history. But Tartaria? Tartaria doesn't fit neatly into any modern nation's founding myth. It crosses too many borders. It complicates too many territorial claims. So it gets written out, divided up. Its history absorbed into the narratives of the empires that replaced it. Look at what happened to the Tartarian language. If this empire existed, they must have had a written language, right? Records, books, official documents. Where are they? Some researchers point to Old Turkic and various Central Asian scripts that were systematically suppressed during the Russian Empire's expansion and the Soviet era. Libraries were burned. Monuments with inscriptions were destroyed or defaced. The Soviet policy was explicit: unify the republics under Russian language and Soviet identity. Any regional languages or historical narratives that contradicted this were eliminated. China did something similar. As the Qing dynasty expanded westward, they absorbed territories that old maps labeled as Tartary. These regions were rebranded, their peoples reclassified into ethnic categories that fit Chinese administrative needs: Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz. All these groups might have once identified as Tartarian or been part of a larger Tartarian cultural sphere. But that identity was fragmented, replaced with smaller ethnic labels that were easier to manage and control. So who were the Tartarians? Maybe they were the original inhabitants of the Eurasian heartland, a civilization that predated the Mongol invasions, that built the classical architecture we see worldwide, that understood energy and technology in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. Maybe they were the people who created the infrastructure that later empires claimed as their own: the buildings, the roads, the sophisticated urban planning that appears fully formed in regions we're told were wilderness. Or maybe, and this is where it gets really speculative, the Tartarians were the remnants of an even older civilization, something that survived cataclysms that destroyed other advanced societies. Atlantis is a name everyone knows, but what if Atlantis wasn't in the Atlantic? What if the survivors of that or a similar catastrophe settled in Central Asia, rebuilt, created a new empire that lasted thousands of years until it too was destroyed or conquered, its history deliberately erased by the powers that replaced it? We don't have definitive answers. The truth is, we may never know exactly who the Tartarians were, because too much evidence has been destroyed, too many records have been lost or hidden, and too much time has passed for oral traditions to survive intact. But the fact that we can't answer this question definitively is itself suspicious. For an empire that appears on every map for 300 years, that's mentioned in encyclopedias and travel accounts, that left behind architectural evidence across continents, we should know more. The silence is deafening. What we can say is this: the people who lived in the region we call Tartaria were sophisticated, technologically advanced, and culturally significant enough that their existence was recorded by every major civilization that encountered them. They weren't primitive nomads. They were builders, innovators, and possibly the keepers of knowledge that our current civilization has lost or suppressed. And whoever they were, their story was systematically removed from history, their identity fragmented and scattered, their achievements attributed to other empires, until the very name Tartaria became a mystery that most people have never even heard of. The question isn't just who were the Tartarians. The question is, why don't we know? And who benefited from making sure we forgot? There's a building in St. Petersburg called the Kazan Cathedral. Construction officially began in 1801 and finished in 1811. 10 years. That's the story. Now look at it. Over 100 massive Corinthian columns, each one carved from solid granite. A dome that rises over 250 feet. Intricate sculptures, precise mathematical proportions, perfect symmetry across an enormous footprint. 10 years. With early 19th century technology, let's do the math. Each of those granite columns weighs multiple tons. Quarrying them, transporting them, carving the detailed capitals, positioning them perfectly, all while maintaining exact spacing and alignment across the entire structure. Modern stonemasons estimate that carving a single Corinthian capital by hand takes a skilled craftsman several weeks. The Kazan Cathedral has over 100 columns. That's years of work just for the capitals, assuming you had 100 master carvers working simultaneously. And we haven't even started on the dome, the foundations, the interior, the sculptures. But this isn't unique to Russia. The United States Capitol building. Official construction timeline says it was built between 1793 and 1866, though most of the main structure was supposedly completed much faster. The Pantheon in Paris, the British Museum, the Berlin Cathedral. Hundreds of massive neoclassical structures, all supposedly built during the 17 and 1800s, all displaying the same impossible level of craftsmanship, all constructed faster than modern engineers say is possible. And then there are the star forts. This might be the strangest architectural mystery of all. Scattered across every continent, there are hundreds of fortifications built in perfect geometric star patterns. 5 points, 6 points, 8 points, all with precise angular bastions, all following the same mathematical principles. They exist in Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America. The official story is that these are military fortifications designed in the Renaissance period to withstand cannon fire. The star shape provided overlapping fields of fire, eliminating blind spots. Sounds reasonable until you actually look at them. The precision is absurd. These aren't rough approximations of star shapes. They're geometrically perfect. The angles are exact. The measurements are consistent down to inches across structures hundreds of feet wide. Building one of these would require advanced surveying equipment, precise mathematical calculations, and construction techniques that could maintain accuracy over massive distances. And supposedly, cultures that had barely made contact with each other all independently invented the exact same design and built them with the exact same precision. Fort Jefferson in Florida, Fort Bourtange in the Netherlands, the fortress of Suomenlinna in Finland, Palmanova in Italy. They look like they were designed by the same architect using the same blueprint, but they're separated by thousands of miles and supposedly built by completely different civilizations over a span of centuries. The consistency is impossible to explain through parallel evolution or shared military theory. It's as if someone had a master plan and built these forts worldwide according to a single standard. Now look at the materials. Many of these old structures use granite. Not brick, not wood, not even limestone, which is relatively soft and easy to work. Granite, one of the hardest stones on Earth. Carving granite with hand tools is brutally difficult. Modern stoneworkers using power tools find it challenging, yet these old buildings have granite columns. Granite blocks fitted together with hairline precision. Granite sculptures with details so fine you can see individual feathers on carved eagles, or the folds in stone clothing. The Mausoleum of Hadrian in Rome, now called Castel Sant'Angelo, has granite columns that were supposedly carved in ancient Rome. Fine. The Romans were incredible engineers, but the Alexander Column in St. Petersburg is a single piece of red granite, over 80 feet tall, weighing nearly 1,300 tons. It was erected in 1834. A single piece, carved from solid granite, transported hundreds of miles, lifted into place without modern cranes, and it stands there today, balanced perfectly, with no structural supports, no base pins, nothing holding it up except its own weight and precise engineering. How? The official explanation involves thousands of workers, wooden scaffolding, ropes and time. Lots of time. But even modern engineers with computer modeling and hydraulic equipment would find this task nearly impossible. The margin for error is essentially zero. If the stone isn't perfectly balanced, if the base isn't exactly level, the column tips and shatters. Yet they did this in 1834 with ropes and wooden supports. Let's talk about domes. The Pantheon in Rome has a dome that was the largest in the world for over 1,000 years. Impressive. But then the Renaissance happens and suddenly domes start appearing everywhere, each one pushing the limits of what should be possible. St. Peter's Basilica, the Duomo in Florence, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the United States Capitol. All massive domes, all requiring complex mathematical understanding of stress distribution, load-bearing, and materials science. The interesting thing about these domes is what's on top of them. Almost universally, they're capped with metal. Copper, gold, leaf, sometimes bronze. The official explanation is decorative. These metals weather well and create stunning visual effects. True, but these metals are also highly conductive. And the domes themselves often sit atop buildings with extensive metalwork running through their structure. Metal frames, metal supports, metal elements integrated into the design in ways that seem excessive if the only purpose is structural support. Research into historical electricity reveals something fascinating. Before the widespread adoption of coal and oil power, There were experiments with atmospheric electricity, the idea that you could pull electrical current directly from the air, from the potential difference between the ground and the upper atmosphere. Benjamin Franklin famously experimented with this. Nikola Tesla built his entire career on wireless energy transmission, and the architecture required for such a system: tall buildings, conductive materials, domed tops that could act as resonance chambers, metal spires reaching into the sky. Look at old buildings with this in mind. The spires, the metal finials, the conductive pathways running through the architecture. They're not decorative, they're functional. Or they were. Many of these buildings had their original electrical systems removed during renovations in the early 1900s. The wiring was called outdated. The metal elements were melted down. The original purpose was forgotten or deliberately obscured. What remains looks ornamental, but researchers believe these structures were designed as power collection and distribution systems. And it's not just the big famous buildings. Courthouses, libraries, train stations, government buildings across America and Europe, all built in the same era, all following the same architectural language. High ceilings with acoustic properties that enhance sound in specific ways. Columns and archways positioned at intervals that suggest harmonic resonance. Floors made of materials that conduct or insulate depending on the room's purpose. This isn't random. This is intentional design based on principles we've largely forgotten. Take acoustics. Modern concert halls spend millions on acoustic engineering, using computer models to determine exactly how sound will behave in a space. Yet old cathedrals and theatres, built centuries ago, have acoustic properties that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Whisper galleries where you can hear someone speak from hundreds of feet away. Spaces where music resonates perfectly, without amplification. Rooms designed so that someone speaking from a specific spot can be heard clearly throughout an enormous hall. They understood sound in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. The same goes for lighting. Before electricity, buildings relied on natural light. But look at how old structures use windows, mirrors, reflective surfaces. The angles are calculated. Light enters the building and is directed, bounced, distributed to illuminate interior spaces that should be dark. Some researchers have found that on specific days, solstices and equinoxes, light enters these buildings and illuminates specific architectural elements or artwork, suggesting the structures were aligned with astronomical events. This isn't primitive superstition. This is advanced understanding of geometry, astronomy, and light physics. Then there's the question of labor. The official story requires us to believe that thousands of skilled craftsmen were available to work on these projects simultaneously. Where did they all come from? How were they trained? Who paid them? These buildings cost fortunes, even by modern standards. The United States Capitol cost $4.5 million in 1800s money. That's hundreds of millions in today's currency. For a young nation, barely a century old, constantly fighting wars and expanding westward, where did that money come from? And why spend it on architecture this elaborate when simpler, cheaper buildings would have served the same function? Unless they didn't build them. Unless these structures were already there, inherited from whoever came before. The construction timelines become budgets for renovation, not original construction. The workers in those old photographs weren't building. They were restoring, digging out buried floors, repairing damage, converting the buildings for new purposes. This would explain why construction happens so fast, why the architecture is so consistent across vast distances, why the technology seems too advanced for the era, and it would explain why so many of these buildings were destroyed. If they're just beautiful architecture, why not preserve them? Why tear down the most magnificent structures from the world's fairs? Why demolish grand old buildings to replace them with simple modern structures, unless those buildings were evidence? Evidence of a previous civilization, a previous level of technology, a previous understanding of energy and physics that contradicted the narrative being constructed about human progress and history. The architecture tells a story, not the one in textbooks, but a different story. One where humanity inherited a world of magnificent structures, understood them poorly, used them for a while, then gradually lost the knowledge of how they worked or why they were built that way. We kept the shells, the impressive facades, but we gutted the interiors, and removed the systems that made them functional. And now we stand in these buildings, admiring their beauty, never questioning how they were possible or what they were really for. Because if we ask those questions, if we really examined the architecture with fresh eyes and honest skepticism, we'd have to admit something uncomfortable. We might not be as advanced as we think. We might have actually regressed, and the ancestors we've been taught to think of as primitive might have known things we've forgotten. Things about energy, about construction, about working with natural forces instead of against them. Things that somebody decided we shouldn't remember. Something happened in the 1800s. Something big enough to leave scars across every continent, yet somehow subtle enough that most people never learned about it in school. The pieces are scattered through historical records, but when you start putting them together, a pattern emerges that doesn't match the smooth narrative of progress and industrial revolution we've been taught. September 1st, 1859. Telegraph systems across North America and Europe suddenly went haywire. Operators reported sparks flying from their equipment. Some received electric shocks. Papers caught fire. And here's the strange part. Some telegraph systems continued working even after being disconnected from their batteries. They were receiving power from somewhere else. The sky itself was alive with light. Aurora borealis visible as far south as the Caribbean. People in the Rocky Mountains woke up at night thinking it was dawn because the sky was so bright. This was the Carrington event, named after the astronomer Richard Carrington, who observed the solar flare that caused it. A massive ejection of plasma from the sun that slammed into Earth's magnetic field with unprecedented force. Scientists today call it the most powerful geomagnetic storm in recorded history. If something like this happened now, it would destroy our electrical grid, knock out satellites, cause trillions in damage. In 1859, we barely had electrical infrastructure, so the damage was minimal, right? That's the official story. But think about the timing. The Carrington event happens in 1859. Within the next few decades, we see the mud flood evidence appear. Cities being buried and excavated. Orphan trains moving hundreds of thousands of children. Insane asylums overflowing. Empty city photographs. The World's Fairs showcasing buildings that appear too quickly. And Tartaria disappearing from maps. All of this clustering around the same period in the mid to late 1800s. What if the Carrington event wasn't an isolated incident? What if it was part of something larger? Solar activity follows cycles, and the mid-1800s was a period of intense solar storms. Multiple events, not just one, each one potentially triggering earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, atmospheric disturbances. The Earth's magnetic field protects us from solar radiation, but during these storms, that protection weakens. What happens to the planet when its electromagnetic shield gets hammered repeatedly? Look at what else was happening. 1815. Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted in what's considered the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded history. So much ash was thrown into the atmosphere that 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed worldwide. Snow fell in June in the northeastern United States. Europe experienced food riots and famine. This is documented, accepted history. But volcanic eruptions don't happen in isolation. Tambora was followed by increased seismic activity worldwide. 1812. Massive earthquakes in the central United States along the New Madrid Fault. So powerful, they rang church bells in Boston, over 1,000 miles away. They temporarily reversed the flow of the Mississippi River. Eyewitness accounts described the ground rolling in waves, forests being destroyed, entire landscapes being reshaped. And this wasn't in California, where people expect earthquakes. This was the middle of the continent, in regions considered geologically stable. Then there's the question of population. Census data from the 1800s shows something odd. Population numbers don't grow smoothly. There are gaps, sudden drops, periods where the expected increase doesn't happen, or where numbers actually decline. The official explanations point to disease, war, migration, and sure, those factors matter, but the scale of population disruption during the mid-1800s seems disproportionate to the documented causes. The orphan trains are part of this mystery. Between 1854 and 1929, The Children's Aid Society and other organizations transported over 200,000 children from eastern cities to rural areas in the Midwest and West. The stated purpose was to give poor urban children better lives on farms. Noble goal. But 200,000 children? Where did they come from? Who were their parents? Many of these children had no records, no birth certificates, no documentation of family history. They were just there. Orphanages overflowing with kids who couldn't identify their parents, couldn't say where they came from, couldn't explain how they ended up alone. Some were old enough to remember families, but their stories were often dismissed as confused or traumatized memories. What kind of event separates hundreds of thousands of children from their families across an entire continent? And it wasn't just children. The insane asylum boom of the late 1800s is staggering. Every state, every major city, building massive mental institutions. The Kirkbride Plan, a specific architectural design for asylums, became standard. These weren't small facilities. They were enormous complexes designed to house thousands of patients, and they filled up immediately. Overcrowding was a constant problem. The diagnoses were often vague: melancholia, mania, hysteria, moral insanity. Many patients were institutionalized for behaviors that today wouldn't be considered mental illness at all. Women who were too independent, men who questioned authority, people who claimed to remember a different past, a different world. What if at least some of these people weren't insane? What if they were traumatized survivors of something that had destroyed their previous lives, and their memories didn't match the new official narrative being constructed? Then there are the photographs. Collections of images from the 1870s, 80s, 90s, showing major cities that look wrong, beautiful architecture, wide streets, impressive buildings, but hardly any people. Or photos of the same locations just a few years apart showing dramatic changes. Not gradual development, but sudden transformations. Buildings that weren't there are suddenly there. Landscapes that were wild are suddenly civilized. Or the reverse. Developed areas that appear abandoned, partially buried, being excavated. Some of these images show cities under construction, or so the captions claim. But look closely. The construction isn't building up, it's digging out. Workers are removing earth from around existing structures. They're excavating streets that are already paved. They're uncovering buildings that are already complete. This doesn't look like construction. It looks like recovery. It looks like people trying to reclaim a buried civilization. Weather patterns during the 1800s were also unusual. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures that had lasted for centuries, was ending. But the transition wasn't smooth. Extreme weather events became common. Floods, droughts, unseasonable cold snaps, brutal heat waves. Agricultural records show crop failures happening with disturbing frequency. Food shortages driving migration and social upheaval. Could all of this be connected? Solar storms disrupting the Earth's magnetic field, increased seismic and volcanic activity, climate instability, massive floods of liquefied Earth burying cities, population displacement on a scale that left hundreds of thousands of orphans, psychological trauma so widespread that asylums couldn't handle the numbers, and in the aftermath, survivors inheriting a world they didn't build, trying to make sense of magnificent structures and advanced technology they no longer understood. The term Great Reset gets used by researchers exploring this theory. The idea that civilization underwent a catastrophic collapse and rapid rebuild during the 1800s, that what we call the Industrial Revolution wasn't entirely about new inventions and progress, but also about rediscovering and reverse engineering older technology. That the explosion of patents and innovations in the late 1800s came from people figuring out how inherited machines and systems worked, then claiming them as new inventions. This would explain some oddities in the historical record. Why so many different inventors supposedly came up with similar devices at the same time. Why certain technologies appeared suddenly without the expected progression of earlier, cruder versions. Why there are machines from the 1800s that we still can't fully explain or replicate. What if they weren't inventing? What if they were remembering, or finding, or copying? It would also explain the aggressive standardization of education that happened during this period. Before the mid-1800s, Education was localized, varied, taught different histories in different regions. After the 1800s, we see the rise of standardized curricula, approved textbooks, unified narratives about history and science. The Rockefeller Foundation and other organizations poured money into shaping what children learned. Why? If it was just about improving education, why the emphasis on controlling the narrative? Because if there was a reset, if civilization did collapse and rebuild, the survivors would need a story that made sense of the world they inherited, a story that explained the buildings, the technology, the remnants of whatever came before. And that story couldn't include the truth, whatever the truth was, because the truth might be too disturbing, too disruptive, too dangerous to the power structures being established by those who controlled the narrative. So they created a new history, a history where humanity progressed linearly from primitive to modern, where every building was built by the people who claimed to build it, where every invention came from the inventor whose name was attached, where disasters were natural, manageable, part of the expected challenges of civilization, where there were no lost empires, no buried cities, no forgotten technology, just steady, predictable progress. And most people believed it, because what else were they supposed to believe? The alternative was too big, too frightening. Better to accept the comfortable story, the one that made sense, the one that didn't require questioning everything. Better to move forward, to build the new world, than to dwell on whatever catastrophe had destroyed the old one. But the evidence remains, in the geological record, in the photographs, in the census data, in the orphan train records and asylum archives, in the buried first floors and the too advanced architecture, in the gaps and inconsistencies that nobody talks about. The 1800s weren't just a century of progress, they were a century of recovery, of rebuilding, of covering up. And whatever happened during that great reset, whoever decided what the new story would be, they did their job well. Because most people today have no idea any of this even happened. They just accept the history they were taught and never ask why so much doesn't quite add up. Nikola Tesla died alone in a New York hotel room on January 7th, 1943. Within hours, FBI agents entered his room and seized all his papers, notebooks, and research materials. They claimed it was for national security. Tesla had been working on wireless energy transmission, particle beam weapons, and technologies that allegedly could provide unlimited power to the entire planet. His work was classified. Most of it has never been released to the public. Now here's the question. Why would the government suppress technology that could give everyone free, unlimited energy? The official answer is that Tesla's ideas were impractical, too expensive to implement, or simply didn't work. But Tesla had already proven they worked. He had demonstrated wireless energy transmission. He had lit up light bulbs from miles away without any physical connection. He had built towers designed to broadcast electrical power through the air to anyone who wanted to receive it. And then his funding disappeared. His projects were shut down, and history remembers him as a brilliant but eccentric inventor whose ideas were ahead of their time. But what if his ideas weren't ahead of their time? What if they were behind their time? What if Tesla wasn't inventing new technology, but rediscovering old technology? Technology that had been used before, in those magnificent buildings we talked about earlier, in the Tartarian Empire that supposedly never existed. Look again at those old structures, the copper domes, the metal spires reaching into the sky, the conductive materials integrated throughout the architecture, the specific geometric proportions. Tesla himself said that if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And what are those old buildings if not giant resonance chambers designed to work with energy, frequency, and vibration? The principle isn't even that complicated. The Earth itself is a massive electrical system. There's a potential difference between the ground and the upper atmosphere, constantly maintained by lightning, cosmic radiation, and the planet's own electromagnetic field. In simple terms, the air above us is positively charged, and the ground beneath us is negatively charged. That's a battery. A giant, natural, constantly replenishing battery that surrounds the entire planet. Tesla understood this. His Wardenclyffe Tower, built in 1901 and 1902 on Long Island, was designed to tap into this system, not to generate electricity, but to harvest it from the atmosphere and transmit it wirelessly to receivers anywhere on Earth. Imagine a world where you didn't need power plants, power lines, or electric bills. You just have a receiver, and you'd pull energy directly from the air around you, the same way a radio receives signals. The tower was never completed. Tesla's main financier, J.P. Morgan, pulled his funding. The official reason was that Tesla couldn't explain how to make money from technology that anyone could use for free. Morgan supposedly said, "If anyone can just pull energy from the air, where do we put the meter? How do we charge people?" No profit meant no funding. But think about what this really means. The technology worked. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that it worked too well. It would have made the entire energy industry obsolete. Coal, oil, gas, power companies, everything that generated massive wealth and control for a small group of powerful industrialists would have become worthless overnight. So they killed it. Not because it was impossible, but because it was too possible. And here's where it connects back to those old buildings. Many of them were constructed before Tesla's time, yet they have all the features you'd need for atmospheric energy collection. Tall structures to maximize the potential difference, metal components to conduct electricity, domes that could act as capacitors or resonance chambers, specific architectural proportions that match frequencies known to be optimal for energy transmission. Some researchers have found that certain old buildings, particularly churches and cathedrals, have measurable electromagnetic properties. Standing in specific spots, you can detect variations in the magnetic field. Some people report feeling energized or experiencing unusual sensations in these locations. Skeptics say it's just the power of suggestion, but the electromagnetic readings are real and measurable. These buildings are doing something, even if we no longer understand what. Look at the pipe organs in old cathedrals. Massive instruments with hundreds or thousands of pipes, each one tuned to specific frequencies. The official purpose is music, and yes, they make beautiful music, but frequency can do more than create sound. Frequency can resonate with physical structures. It can create standing waves. It can, under the right conditions, interact with electromagnetic fields in ways that could potentially generate or amplify electrical current. Tesla experimented with resonance extensively. He discovered that every object has a natural frequency, and if you match that frequency with an external source, you can cause the object to vibrate intensely. He famously claimed he could bring down a building with a small mechanical oscillator tuned to the right frequency. Whether he actually could or not, the principle is sound. Resonance is real, it's powerful. And those old buildings with their specific proportions, their acoustic properties, their conductive materials, were designed with resonance in mind. Then there's the question of what happened to these systems. If old buildings were designed to function as energy collectors or distributors, when did they stop working? The answer seems to be around the late 1800s, early 1900s, exactly when the supposed Great Reset occurred, exactly when Tesla was shut down, exactly when the architecture shifted from classical to modern. Renovations of old buildings in the early 20th century often involved removing metal elements. Copper roofing was replaced with tar and shingles. Metal frameworks were removed or covered. Conductive pathways were interrupted. The official reason was modernization, but the effect was to disable whatever systems these buildings originally had. Whether this was intentional suppression or just ignorant destruction, the result is the same. The buildings still stand, but they no longer function as they were designed to. Consider the implications. If free energy technology existed, if it was widespread, if cities were powered without burning fuel, that would fundamentally change civilization. No need for coal mines, no need for oil wells, no pollution, no energy scarcity, no utility companies controlling access to power. The entire economic structure of the modern world is built on energy being a commodity you have to buy. Free energy destroys that model completely. Who benefits from keeping energy scarce and expensive? Energy companies, obviously, but also governments, because controlling energy means controlling economies. It means controlling development. It means controlling which nations rise and which nations stay dependent. Energy isn't just about keeping the lights on. It's about power in every sense of the word. Political power, economic power, the power to determine who gets to advance and who stays behind. This is why Tesla's work was suppressed. This is why his papers were seized. This is why technologies that could revolutionize energy production consistently fail to get funding or mysteriously disappear. Not because they don't work, but because they work too well, because they threaten the fundamental control structure of modern civilization. And it's still happening today. Inventors who claim to have developed over-unity devices, machines that produce more energy than they consume, are routinely discredited, denied patents, or have their work confiscated. The Patent Office has a special classification for inventions that threaten national security. Once something gets that classification, it disappears. No public disclosure, no commercial development, just gone. Some of these inventors have died under suspicious circumstances. Others have been bought out, their technology acquired by corporations that then shelve it. A few have released their designs to the public, but without funding or institutional support, individuals can't bring these technologies to market. The system is designed to prevent disruption, to maintain the status quo, to ensure that energy remains something you have to buy from approved sources. But the old buildings remain, silent testimony to a time when energy might have been free, when technology worked with natural forces instead of against them, when civilization was structured differently. We walk past these buildings every day. We admire their beauty. We use them as museums and government offices and concert halls. But we don't understand them. We've forgotten what they were really for. Tesla knew. He tried to show us. He tried to give us back what we'd lost. And for that, he was shut down, discredited, and left to die alone, and broke while lesser inventors got rich and famous. His crime wasn't being wrong. His crime was being right. His crime was threatening to free humanity from dependence on the energy cartels that control the modern world. The technology still exists. The principles haven't changed. Physics doesn't care about economics or politics. The Earth is still a giant battery. The atmosphere still has electrical potential. The knowledge of how to tap into these systems is still available if you know where to look. But it's suppressed, hidden, dismissed as pseudoscience or conspiracy theory. Because the people who control energy don't want to lose that control, and they'll do whatever it takes to make sure free energy stays in the past, buried along with Tartaria and everything else that doesn't fit the approved narrative. The official story of the world's fairs is inspiring, nations coming together to showcase human achievement, innovation, and cultural exchange. Millions of visitors marveling at exhibits, demonstrating the latest technology, and celebrating progress. Temporary cities of breathtaking beauty built specifically for these events, then dismantled when the celebrations ended. It's a beautiful narrative, but when you dig into the details, the timeline, and what actually happened to these structures, something much stranger emerges. Let's start with Chicago, 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition. The fairgrounds covered more than 600 acres, over 200 buildings. The centerpiece was the Court of Honor, a collection of massive neoclassical structures surrounding a reflecting pool. These weren't small buildings. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building alone was 3 times larger than the Pentagon. It had a roof that covered over 44 acres, without interior support columns. Nothing like it had ever been built before. Or had it? Construction officially began in 1891. Daniel Burnham was the lead architect, coordinating the work of multiple designers and thousands of laborers. The timeline was brutally tight. 2 years to design and construct an entire city. Not just buildings, but working infrastructure, electrical systems, water systems, transportation, streets, landscaping, sculptures. And remember, this is 1891. No power tools as we know them today. No modern construction equipment. Most work was done with hand tools, horses, and human muscle. Yet when the fair opened on May 1st, 1893, everything was finished. Perfect. Visitors walked through what they called the White City, overwhelmed by the beauty and scale. Photographs from the event show structures that look like they'd been standing for decades. Weathered, settled. Not fresh construction but established architecture. Now here's where it gets interesting. Look at photographs of the fairgrounds before construction allegedly began. Several images exist showing the area in 1890 and 1891. In some of these photos, buildings are already visible, not under construction, standing. The official explanation is that these are either misidentified photos from later or they show existing structures on the site. But researchers have found images clearly dated before the fair with white city buildings visible in the background. And then there's the question of what happened after. The fair closed in October 1893, 6 months of operation. Then demolition. The buildings were torn down or burned. The official reason? They were temporary structures, built with staff, a mixture of plaster and fibre, not meant to last, just for show. But look at the construction photos. Those aren't plaster facades. They're real buildings with stone foundations, metal frameworks, electrical wiring, plumbing. The manufacturer's building had working elevators. The transportation building had intricate metalwork and gilded surfaces. These weren't movie sets. They were functional structures that could have lasted decades, maybe centuries, with proper maintenance. Why destroy them? Chicago was growing rapidly. These buildings could have been repurposed as museums, civic centers, housing. Instead, they were systematically demolished. Some burned in mysterious fires. The official story says it was more economical to destroy them than maintain them. Does that make sense? You spend millions building something magnificent. It operates successfully for 6 months, attracts millions of visitors, and then you burn it down because maintenance would be too expensive? Unless the goal wasn't to showcase modern construction but to explain existing architecture, to provide a narrative for why these impossible buildings existed. The fair wasn't celebrating what humanity could build. It was showcasing what had already been built, attributing it to modern architects, then destroying the evidence before too many people started asking uncomfortable questions. St. Louis, 1904. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Same pattern. Massive classical buildings, constructed in an impossibly short time. Over 1,500 buildings on 1,200 acres. A forest in the middle of the fairgrounds with enormous old-growth trees that supposedly were just there. The Palace of Varied Industries was the largest exhibition hall in the world at that time, built in 2 years, then demolished after the fair. But here's something nobody talks about much. The St. Louis Fair featured something called the Anthropology Department, living exhibits of indigenous peoples from around the world. Filipinos, Native Americans, Africans, displayed in recreated villages for fairgoers to observe. The official purpose was education, showing cultural diversity. But look at what they were really doing. They were displaying people as primitive, as less advanced, as examples of what humanity was before modern civilization. Why? What purpose did that serve? It created a narrative. It showed fairgoers that progress was real, that modern Western civilization represented the pinnacle of human development, and that other cultures were relics of earlier stages. It was social programming, teaching people to see history as a linear progression from primitive to advanced, with modern industrial civilization at the top. And it wasn't just indigenous peoples. The fairs also featured incubator babies, actual premature infants displayed in incubators as technological marvels. Parents could pay to have their premature babies cared for at the fair, where thousands of people would walk by and observe them like zoo animals. The official justification was promoting medical technology, but the psychological effect was teaching people to trust institutions, to see technology as savior, to accept that experts knew better than families about how to raise children. San Francisco, 1915. The Panama Pacific International Exposition, built to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal and to show that San Francisco had recovered from the devastating earthquake of 1906. Once again, massive classical buildings constructed in less than 3 years. The Tower of Jewels, covered with over 100,000 cut-glass Novagiums that sparkled in the Sunday the Palace of Fine Arts, which survives today as one of San Francisco's most beautiful landmarks. Construction photos from the fair show something odd. Workers aren't building from the ground up. They're working on structures that already have foundations, already have basic forms. The photos look like restoration work, not new construction. and after the fair, almost everything was demolished, except the Palace of Fine Arts, which was supposedly saved by public outcry. But maybe it was kept because it was the most obvious example of inherited architecture, and destroying it would have raised too many questions. The timing of these fairs is also suspicious. They clustered in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right after the supposed Great Reset, right when cities were being excavated from mud, right when populations were recovering from whatever catastrophe had occurred. And they all followed the same pattern. Build impossible structures in impossible time frames, showcase them for a few months, destroy them, move on. It's almost like they were clearing evidence, taking buildings that had survived the catastrophe, bringing them to public attention under the guise of modern construction, then eliminating them before serious architectural analysis could be done. The fairs created a controlled narrative. Millions of people saw these buildings. Millions of people were told they were modern creations. And then those witnesses watched them be destroyed, cementing in the public consciousness that these were temporary, that they weren't important, that they represented a moment of celebration rather than evidence of a lost civilization. And there's another element. The fairs were also used to introduce new technologies to the public. Electric lights, telephones, X-rays, moving pictures, technologies that supposedly were brand new inventions. But what if some of these weren't new? What if they were rediscovered or reverse engineered from Tartarian technology? The fairs provided a cover story, a public debut that made it seem like these technologies were emerging naturally from modern innovation, when in reality they might have been taken from the inherited infrastructure and repackaged as contemporary breakthroughs. Look at the electrical systems at these fairs. Massive lighting displays, thousands of bulbs illuminating the grounds. The official story is that Edison's systems or Tesla's alternating current made this possible. And yes, those technologies were real. But the scale and sophistication of the electrical infrastructure at these fairs suggests something more. Suggests that the buildings themselves were already wired, already designed for electrical systems, and the fair organizers were simply plugging into existing capabilities. Why doesn't any of this get discussed? Why aren't historians asking these questions? Because the narrative is too important. The story of human progress, of civilization advancing from primitive to modern, is foundational to how we understand ourselves. If that story is wrong, if we actually inherited an advanced civilization and then regressed, if the buildings we admire most weren't built by the people we credit, then everything changes. Our understanding of history, of capability, of who we are and where we came from, all of it has to be re-examined. The world's fairs weren't celebrations of progress. They were erasure events, carefully orchestrated opportunities to display inherited architecture, attribute it to modern builders, then destroy the evidence, while millions of witnesses were told they were seeing temporary structures. It was brilliant, really. Use the public as validators of the lie. Let them see the buildings, believe the story, watch the destruction, and then those witnesses become defenders of the narrative because they were there. They saw it. They believe it. Even though what they saw and what they were told don't quite match up if you look closely enough. Here's a question that should bother everyone. If Tartaria was real, if there's evidence of advanced civilizations that don't fit our historical timeline, if the architecture and maps and buried cities all point to something we've been told doesn't exist, why doesn't anyone learn about this in school? Why do history textbooks completely ignore this? The answer is simpler and more disturbing than you might think. Because history isn't written by scholars seeking truth. It's written by whoever controls the narrative. Before the mid-1800s, education looked completely different. There was no standardized curriculum, no national textbooks, no agreed-upon version of history that every child had to learn. Schools were local. Teachers used whatever materials they had access to. Different regions taught different stories about the past. A kid in Boston learned different history than a kid in Virginia, who learned different history than a kid in Ohio. There was no central authority dictating what counted as official knowledge. Then something changed, rapidly. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, we see the emergence of standardized education systems across the Western world. Governments and private foundations started pouring money into creating uniform curricula, approved textbooks, teacher training programs that ensured everyone was teaching the same material the same way. And the justification was noble. Education should be consistent. Every child deserves quality instruction. Knowledge should be standardized, so everyone has the same opportunities. But standardization means control. When you control what gets taught, you control what people think is true. And the people funding this standardization weren't neutral academics. They were industrialists, bankers, political leaders, people with specific interests in shaping how the next generation understood the world. The Rockefeller Foundation was particularly influential. John D. Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest men in history, established the General Education Board in 1902. Its stated mission was to promote education in the United States. Its real effect was to shape curricula nationwide. The foundation funded schools, trained teachers, published textbooks, and the version of history in those textbooks served a specific purpose. It promoted industrial capitalism. It taught children that progress was inevitable, that the current system was the result of natural evolution. That questioning established narratives was foolish because experts had already determined the truth. Think about what was happening at this exact time. The late 1800s, early 1900s. The same period when Tartaria disappeared from maps. When world's fairs were showcasing and destroying impossible architecture. When cities were being excavated from mud. When orphan trains were redistributing massive numbers of children. When the entire structure of society was being rebuilt after whatever catastrophe had occurred. And right in the middle of this, powerful interests took control of education and started teaching everyone the same story. That's not coincidence. That's erasure, deliberate, systematic erasure of anything that didn't fit the approved narrative. And it worked because most people trust authority. When a textbook says something is true, especially a textbook approved by respected institutions and taught by trained teachers, why would anyone question it? You'd have to be a conspiracy theorist, right? You'd have to be someone who doesn't trust experts, doesn't respect education, doesn't understand how knowledge works, except that framing is exactly how control is maintained. Anyone who asks uncomfortable questions gets labeled as fringe, as uneducated, as someone who doesn't understand how to evaluate evidence. The system protects itself by making skepticism seem like ignorance. And most people would rather be seen as smart and educated than risk being dismissed as a crank who believes in debunked theories. But what makes something debunked? Who decides? When historians say Tartaria was just a vague geographic term, what evidence are they using? When archaeologists dismiss mudflood theories, have they actually examined the structures, or are they repeating what they were taught? When educators say the world's fairs were exactly what they claim to be, are they looking at the photographs and timelines critically, or are they defending a narrative they've built their careers on? Academic institutions have gatekeepers. You can't become a professional historian without getting degrees from accredited universities. Those universities have specific requirements. You have to write dissertations that conform to accepted methodologies. You have to publish in peer-reviewed journals where other academics decide if your work is valid. And those academics were trained the same way, in the same system, learning the same narratives. Anyone who challenges the fundamental story too strongly doesn't get published, doesn't get tenure, doesn't get taken seriously. It's not always a conscious conspiracy. Most historians genuinely believe what they teach. They've spent years studying, mastering enormous amounts of information within the accepted framework. They're not lying. They're repeating what they've been taught by people who repeated what they were taught going back generations. The original lie, if there was one, happened so long ago that everyone now just accepts it as established fact. But here's the tell. When evidence contradicts the narrative, the evidence gets explained away, not the narrative. Maps showing Tartaria? Just imprecise geography. Mudflood evidence? Urban development and flooding. Impossible construction timelines? We must not understand the methods they used. Advanced technology in old buildings? We're misinterpreting decorative elements. Every piece of contradictory evidence gets a footnote, a dismissal, a reason why it doesn't really challenge the accepted story. This is how institutional knowledge works. It's conservative by design. It resists change. New ideas have to fight against enormous inertia to gain acceptance. And if those new ideas threaten fundamental narratives that entire fields are built on, they face nearly insurmountable resistance. Because accepting that Tartaria was real, that there was a catastrophic reset, that our timeline is wrong, doesn't just mean adding a chapter to history books. It means rewriting everything. It means admitting that generations of scholars were wrong about basic facts. It means acknowledging that the people who standardized education might have done so to hide truth rather than reveal it. Who wants to admit that? What historian wants to say their life's work was based on false premises? What institution wants to confess that they've been teaching lies for over a century? The incentive structure of academia punishes truth-seeking when that truth challenges foundational narratives. You advance by supporting the consensus, by building on accepted work, by being a team player. You destroy your career by being the person who says everything we think we know is wrong. And beyond academia, there are political reasons for maintaining the approved history. National identities are built on historical narratives. The United States sees itself as a young nation that built itself from wilderness through innovation and hard work. That story justifies American exceptionalism, westward expansion, all of it. If the truth is that Americans inherited magnificent infrastructure from a previous civilization, if the wilderness was actually the ruins of an advanced empire, if progress is a myth covering up regression, then American identity itself gets called into question. The same applies everywhere. Russia's narrative about expanding into Siberia, China's story about its continuous civilization, European colonialism justified by bringing civilization to primitive lands. All of these narratives depend on the current version of history being true. Change that history, and you undermine the legitimacy of current power structures. And power doesn't surrender easily. It fights. It suppresses. It controls the narrative by controlling education, media, and academic institutions. So history textbooks stay silent about Tartaria, not because there's no evidence, but because acknowledging the evidence would require dismantling the entire structure of how we understand the past. It would mean admitting that the maps were right, the architecture is impossible, the timeline doesn't work, and something fundamental has been hidden from us. And the people in positions to make those admissions have every reason not to. Their careers, their reputations, their worldviews, all of it depends on the current story being true, which means the silence isn't accidental. It's not ignorance. It's not that historians haven't noticed these anomalies. It's that they've noticed and chosen, either consciously or unconsciously, to ignore them, because asking these questions means risking everything. And most people, even scholars, even people who claim to value truth, won't take that risk. They'll rationalize. They'll explain away. They'll protect the narrative because the alternative is too costly. And that's exactly how big lies persist. Not through force, but through fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being excluded. Fear of losing everything you've built your life on. And as long as that fear is stronger than the desire for truth, the history books will stay silent. And the real story of our past will remain hidden in plain sight, visible only to those willing to look and brave enough to question what they've been taught. Now let's be fair. We've spent this entire journey looking at evidence that challenges the official narrative, but mainstream historians and archaeologists have responses to all of this. They have explanations, and some of those explanations are actually reasonable. So let's look at what the other side says, what their arguments are, and where those arguments might be strong or weak. First, Tartaria itself. Academic consensus is clear. Tartaria, or Tartary, was never a unified empire. It was a catch-all term used by European cartographers for the vast, poorly understood regions of Central and Northern Asia. The word comes from Tartarus, the Greek underworld, combined with references to Tartar peoples. Europeans didn't know much about these regions, so they labeled them vaguely. As geographic knowledge improved through exploration and colonial expansion, more accurate names replaced the generic Tartary label. By the late 1800s, Europeans understood that this area included multiple distinct regions, Russia, Mongolia, parts of China, so the umbrella term fell out of use. That's a logical explanation. Maps from earlier periods are notoriously imprecise about distant lands. Medieval European maps showed all sorts of imaginary places. Terra Australis, Prester John's Kingdom, the mountains of Kong in Africa that never existed. Cartographers filled in blank spaces with speculation. Maybe Tartaria was just another example of that. But here's where that explanation gets shaky. Tartaria appears on maps for 300 years, not just in the medieval period when accuracy was poor, but well into the 1800s when cartography had become a serious science. The maps don't show it as mysterious or speculative. They show it with defined borders, marked cities, subdivisions into different types of Tartary. That's not vague speculation. That's documentation of something specific. Next, the mudflood evidence. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges that many cities raised their street levels during the 19th century, but they attribute this to deliberate urban planning, not catastrophe. Cities flooded regularly before modern drainage systems. Streets were muddy, unsanitary. As civil engineering improved, city planners decided to raise street levels, install underground sewers, and create more livable urban environments. Seattle, Chicago, and other cities documented this process. There are records, budgets, engineering reports. It happened. It just wasn't mysterious. Fair enough. We have documentation of street-raising projects, but that doesn't explain everything. Why does the buried level look like it was covered rapidly rather than gradually built over? Why are there photographs showing workers excavating rather than constructing? Why did this happen simultaneously in cities across different continents with no coordination? The urban planning explanation works for individual cities, but struggles to account for the global pattern. The architecture is where mainstream historians feel most confident. They point to extensive documentation of World's Fair construction, photographs showing the building process, payroll records for workers, contracts with suppliers, architectural drawings. Daniel Burnham's personal papers document the Chicago Fair in detail. We have proof these buildings were constructed for the fairs. And that's true. We do have construction documentation. But look at what that documentation shows. Often, it's finishing work, interior decoration, landscaping, not foundation laying or structural work. Some of the construction photos show buildings that already look complete being refinished. And the timeline still doesn't work when you calculate the labor hours required versus the available workforce. Modern construction managers have analyzed the Chicago Fair timeline and consistently say it's impossible with the documented resources. Plus, the documentation being there doesn't mean it's complete or accurate. If you wanted to cover up inherited buildings by claiming you built them, you'd create exactly the kind of records we see. Partial documentation of restoration work presented as full construction. The absence of detailed structural engineering plans could be explained by saying they were lost or were trade secrets. You'd create a paper trail that supports your narrative without providing so much detail that experts could verify or disprove it. Regarding the architecture being too advanced, historians point out that we're underestimating our ancestors. The Romans built the Pantheon 2,000 years ago. Medieval builders created Gothic cathedrals without computers or power tools. Skilled craftsmen throughout history accomplished incredible things, with simple tools and deep knowledge passed through apprenticeship systems. The 1800s had industrial capabilities we forget about. Steam power, advanced metallurgy, factories producing standardized components. It's not impossible that they built these structures. It's impressive, but not impossible. This is actually a strong argument. We do tend to underestimate pre-modern capabilities. The problem is consistency. Yes, humans can build impressive things with hand tools, but when you see identical architectural styles, identical precision, identical design principles appearing simultaneously across the world in cultures that supposedly had minimal contact, coincidence becomes harder to accept. Parallel evolution works for basic shelter. It doesn't work as well for ornate Corinthian columns, with identical proportions showing up in Moscow and Melbourne at the same time. As for free energy and Tesla, mainstream science is blunt. Tesla's wireless energy transmission worked for short distances under specific conditions, but couldn't scale to global distribution. The physics doesn't support unlimited free energy from the atmosphere. Yes, there's electrical potential in the atmosphere, but it's diffuse, unpredictable, and insufficient for powering civilization. Tesla was brilliant, but also prone to exaggeration and over-promising. His failures weren't conspiracies. They were practical limitations of the technology. And again, this is partially valid. Tesla did over-promise. His Wardenclyffe Tower never worked as intended. But the counter-argument is that we don't know if it failed, or if it was shut down before it could succeed. Tesla's papers were seized and classified. We don't have access to his complete research. Modern attempts to recreate his experiments are based on incomplete information. Maybe he was wrong, or maybe we just don't know the full story. The World's Fairs being conspiracies gets dismissed almost out of hand by historians. Millions of people attended these fairs. Thousands of workers built them. Journalists covered them extensively. The idea that this was all a cover-up requires too many people keeping too big a secret. Someone would have talked. Someone would have exposed the truth. Conspiracy theories fall apart at scale because humans can't keep secrets when large numbers are involved. This is perhaps the strongest mainstream argument. Conspiracies do tend to leak. The bigger the conspiracy, the more likely exposure becomes. But what if it wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense? What if most people genuinely believed they were building these structures? What if only a small number of people at the top knew the buildings were inherited, and they created the narrative that everyone else accepted in good faith? You don't need thousands of conspirators. You just need a few people controlling the information while everyone else honestly believes the story they're told. And finally, historians ask the fundamental question: where's the smoking gun? If Tartaria was a massive empire, where are the libraries? The coins? The written records in their own language? Where are the Tartarian artifacts in museums? You can't hide an entire civilization. Physical evidence always remains. And since we don't have clear, unambiguous Tartarian artifacts comparable to Roman or Egyptian or Chinese artifacts, the most logical explanation is that Tartaria as an empire never existed. This is the hardest argument to counter. Physical evidence matters, and mainstream archaeology is right that we don't have obvious Tartarian artifacts. But maybe we do, and just don't recognize them. Maybe artifacts attributed to other cultures were actually Tartarian. Maybe the systematic erasure included destroying or relabeling physical evidence. Maybe what we call Scythian or Mongol or generic Central Asian actually belonged to Tartaria, but was deliberately misattributed. Or maybe Tartaria really was just a geographic term, and everything we've looked at has other explanations. Maybe the maps were imprecise. Maybe the mudflood was urban planning. Maybe the architecture is impressive but explainable. Maybe Tesla failed honestly. Maybe the World's Fairs were exactly what they claimed. Maybe historians are right, and people asking these questions are seeing patterns that aren't there, connecting dots that shouldn't be connected, falling into conspiracy thinking because the alternative is accepting that history is complex and messy, and sometimes doesn't have dramatic hidden secrets. That's possible. It's genuinely possible that the mainstream explanation is correct, and Tartaria conspiracy theories are just modern mythology. But here's what keeps people questioning. The mainstream explanations require accepting a lot of coincidences, a lot of convenient gaps in the record, a lot of evidence that technically could be explained away but still feels wrong. And when pressed on specific details, the anomalies within the anomalies, mainstream historians often fall back on "we don't know yet" or "more research is needed," rather than providing definitive answers. Which means the debate isn't settled. Both sides have arguments. Both sides have evidence. And maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe Tartaria was real but smaller than conspiracy theorists claim. Maybe there was a reset but less catastrophic. Maybe some buildings were inherited and others genuinely built. Maybe history is more complicated than either the official narrative or the alternative theories suggest. And maybe the only honest position is to keep asking questions, keep examining evidence, and admit that our understanding of the past might be incomplete. Because whether you believe the mainstream version or the conspiracy version, one thing is certain: we don't know everything. And the parts we don't know might be the most important parts of all. The Tartaria mystery isn't just about the past, it's about right now. Because if there was a deliberate effort to erase an advanced civilization from history, that effort didn't stop in 1900. It's ongoing. And if you know where to look, you can see it happening in real time. Start with something simple. Try searching for Tartaria on major platforms. YouTube has thousands of videos exploring this topic, but the algorithm doesn't promote them. They don't appear in recommended feeds. They don't trend. Many creators report being demonetized or having their videos age-restricted without clear explanation. The content isn't violent. It's not sexual. It's historical speculation. Yet the platform treats it like something that needs to be contained. Wikipedia, supposedly a neutral encyclopedia anyone can edit, has interesting patterns around this subject. There's an article on Tartary, but it's heavily controlled. Editors who try to add information about the conspiracy theories or alternative interpretations get reverted quickly. The talk pages show constant battles between people trying to expand the article and moderators insisting it remain narrowly focused on the mainstream academic view. Any mention of Tartaria as a possible advanced civilization gets labeled as fringe theory and removed. Why? If Tartaria theories are just baseless conspiracy nonsense, why the active suppression? Why not let people discuss it openly and debunk it with evidence? The fact that information is being controlled suggests someone thinks these ideas are dangerous. Not physically dangerous, dangerous to the approved narrative. Then there's the buildings themselves. Historic structures are being demolished at an alarming rate. Not all of them, obviously. Some are preserved as landmarks. But many old buildings, particularly those with unusual architectural features or those that don't fit neatly into the local historical narrative, disappear quietly. A fire breaks out. Structural damage is discovered. Development pressure leads to demolition. Each individual case has explanations, but the pattern is what matters. In recent years, several significant old buildings with classical architecture have been destroyed under questionable circumstances. The Cass Technical High School in Detroit, built in the early 1900s with elaborate stonework and advanced design features, was demolished in 2011 despite efforts to save it. The old Penn Station in New York was torn down in the 1960s, one of the most beautiful buildings in America, replaced with the current underground maze. Countless others across every city, each loss explained as progress or necessity. But some demolitions feel different. Buildings that were structurally sound. Buildings with features researchers found interesting. Buildings that didn't match the expected timeline for their supposed construction date. And once they're gone, they're gone. No more physical evidence to examine, no more chance to study the construction techniques or discover anomalies that challenge official dates. Just photographs and memories. Antarctica keeps coming up in alternative research circles. Why? Because it's the most restricted continent on Earth. You can't just go there. Tourism is heavily controlled. Scientific research requires government permission. Military presence is significant. The official explanation is environmental protection and scientific preservation. No one wants tourists destroying pristine wilderness or interfering with research. But Antarctica is enormous, larger than the United States and Mexico combined. And it's been buried under ice for millions of years, right? Except that timeline might be wrong. Ice core samples and geological studies suggest Antarctica hasn't always been frozen. There are theories, based on analysis of ancient maps, that Antarctica was mapped when it was ice-free. The Piri-Reis map from 1513 supposedly shows Antarctic coastline details that shouldn't have been known until modern times. What if Antarctica was inhabited? What if structures are buried under that ice? What if some of those structures are being found by research teams but not reported to the public? Multiple countries maintain permanent bases there. China, Russia, the United States, all investing heavily in Antarctic presence. For penguin research or for something else? There are rumors, always rumors. Former military personnel claiming they saw things they weren't supposed to see. Scientists who went to Antarctica and came back different, unwilling to talk about their work. Satellite images that show geometric patterns under the ice before being scrubbed or explained as natural formations. None of this is proof, but the level of secrecy around Antarctica exceeds what environmental protection would require. Then there's patent suppression. The United States Patent Office has a secrecy order system. If an inventor submits a patent that the government believes threatens national security, that patent can be classified. The inventor is legally prohibited from discussing it. The technology disappears from public knowledge. How many patents have been suppressed? According to Freedom of Information Act requests, over 5,000 inventions are currently under secrecy orders. What kind of inventions? Energy devices are common. Anything that could disrupt the energy industry gets scrutinized heavily. Propulsion systems, communication technologies, materials, science breakthroughs. Some of these might genuinely threaten security, but others? They threaten economic models. They threaten the control structures that keep certain industries profitable and certain companies powerful. Inventors who get too close to breakthrough energy technology have a disturbing pattern of misfortune. Some die unexpectedly. Some have their labs raided. Some get bought out by corporations that then shelve the technology. Eugene Malov, a scientist investigating cold fusion, was murdered in 2004 under circumstances that were never fully explained. Stan Meyer, who claimed to have invented a water-powered car, died suddenly in 1998, and some believe he was poisoned. Are these just tragic coincidences, or is there a pattern? Fact-checkers have become aggressive about Tartaria content. Articles debunking Tartaria theories appear on Snopes, Reuters, Associated Press. They all say the same things. Tartaria was just a geographic term. The conspiracy theories are baseless. There's no evidence. Move along. But read these fact-checks carefully. They don't actually address the strongest evidence. They attack strawman versions of the theory, debunk claims nobody serious is making, then declare the entire topic settled. This is a standard tactic. Take a complex subject with multiple lines of evidence. Find the weakest or most extreme claims associated with it. Debunk those claims thoroughly. Then use that debunking to dismiss everything related to the topic. It's effective because most people don't dig deeper. They see that fact-checkers investigated and found nothing, so they assume there's nothing to find. Social media platforms now label Tartaria content, not with outright bans usually, but with information panels. Links to Wikipedia articles. Suggestions to see what authoritative sources say. It's framed as helpful context, but it's also narrative control. Before you even engage with alternative theories, the platform is telling you what the correct interpretation is, priming you to dismiss what you're about to see. And maybe most telling, traditional media won't touch this. Mainstream documentaries don't explore Tartaria. Major newspapers don't write investigative pieces examining the evidence. Universities don't fund research into these questions. It's complete silence from established institutions. Why? If it's all nonsense, easy to debunk, wouldn't there be academic papers systematically dismantling the theories? Wouldn't historians be eager to explain why the maps, the architecture, the mudflood evidence all have mundane explanations? Instead, there's avoidance. The topic is beneath serious consideration. It's for conspiracy theorists and internet amateurs. Real scholars don't waste time on such things. That dismissive attitude itself is suspicious. Real scholars should welcome opportunities to educate the public, to demonstrate why alternative theories are wrong, unless they can't. Unless the evidence is actually harder to explain than they'd like to admit. We're living in a time where information is more available than ever before. You can access historical maps online. You can find photographs of old buildings. You can read Tesla's papers, at least the ones that weren't classified. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. But there's also more control than ever before. Algorithms determining what you see. Fact-checkers telling you what's true. Social pressure to conform to approved narratives. The question isn't whether Tartaria was real. The question is why we're not allowed to seriously ask if it was real. Why that question makes you a conspiracy theorist instead of a curious person examining historical anomalies, and what else might be hidden right now that we're being discouraged from investigating. Because if they erased an empire from history once, what's stopping them from doing it again? What's being hidden today that future generations will stumble upon and wonder how everyone missed? The control continues, the secrets remain, and most people never even realize there are questions they're not supposed to ask. So here we are. We've looked at buildings that defy their construction timelines, maps showing an empire that supposedly never existed, cities buried under mud across every continent, architecture too advanced for the tools available, a catastrophic reset in the 1800s that left orphans, asylums, and empty cities in its wake, free energy technology suppressed, world's fairs that showcased inherited structures before destroying them, educational systems standardized to teach a single approved narrative, and modern suppression of anyone asking these questions too loudly. What does it all mean? That's what you have to decide for yourself. Because here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to tell you Tartaria definitely existed as a globe-spanning advanced empire. I'm not going to claim with certainty that there was a global catastrophe in the 1800s. I'm not going to say I know for sure that free energy was real and is being hidden from us. Those would be conclusions that require more evidence than we currently have access to. But I'm also not going to tell you the official story is definitely correct, that every anomaly has been adequately explained, that mainstream historians have addressed all these questions satisfactorily, that there's nothing suspicious about maps, architecture, timelines, and suppression patterns all pointing in the same uncomfortable direction. What I will say is this: something doesn't add up. The official timeline has too many holes. The explanations require accepting too many coincidences. And the resistance to even discussing these topics seriously suggests that powerful interests don't want people asking these questions. Maybe Tartaria was a massive empire that was deliberately erased. Maybe it was a smaller civilization that got absorbed and forgotten. Maybe it was just a geographic term, and all of this is elaborate pattern seeking by people who want mysteries to exist. The truth could be any of those options or something else entirely. But the process of asking matters more than having definitive answers. Because once you start looking at history with skeptical eyes, once you stop accepting everything authorities tell you just because they're authorities, once you realize that narratives can be constructed and evidence can be hidden or explained away, you start seeing the world differently. You notice things. You ask why buildings in your own city have basement windows at ground level. You wonder why old photographs show empty streets in supposedly thriving metropolises. You question how certain technologies appeared fully formed without the expected developmental stages. You start thinking critically instead of just accepting. And that's dangerous to power structures. Not because you might discover specific secrets, though you might, but because you become someone who questions, someone who examines evidence, someone who doesn't just believe what they're told. And a population of people like that is much harder to control than a population that trusts institutions blindly. History is written by victors. That's not conspiracy theory. That's acknowledged fact. Whoever wins gets to tell the story. And the story they tell always makes them look good, makes their power seem legitimate, makes their version of events seem inevitable and correct. If Tartaria existed and was conquered, absorbed, or destroyed, of course the conquerors would erase it from history. Of course they'd attribute its achievements to themselves. Of course they'd create educational systems teaching their version of events. The question isn't whether this is possible. We know it's possible because we've seen it happen with other civilizations. Native American history was systematically suppressed and rewritten. African empires were ignored or minimized by European colonizers. Chinese and Japanese history were filtered through Western perspectives. The idea that an entire Central Asian empire could be erased isn't far-fetched. It's consistent with how power operates. So what do you do with all this? You keep questioning. You look at evidence with your own eyes, instead of accepting interpretations from authorities. You recognize that not having definitive proof doesn't mean asking questions is wrong. You understand that suppression and dismissal often indicate you're onto something uncomfortable for those in power, and you share what you find. You talk to people. You encourage others to look at the maps, the architecture, the photographs. You normalize the act of questioning official narratives. Because the more people who ask these questions, the harder it becomes to maintain the silence. Maybe we'll never know the full truth about Tartaria. Maybe too much evidence has been destroyed. Maybe the secrets are too well guarded. Or maybe someone will find the smoking gun, the undeniable proof that changes everything. Either way, the investigation matters. The questions matter. The refusal to accept comfortable lies matters. Because at the end of the day, the biggest conspiracy isn't about Tartaria specifically. It's about who gets to decide what's true, who controls the narrative, who benefits from keeping certain questions unasked and certain answers hidden. And once you see that control being exercised, once you recognize the patterns of suppression and manipulation, you can never quite unsee it. So the question we must ask isn't just, was Tartaria real? The question is, what else are we not being told? And more importantly, why are we not allowed to ask? Those questions don't have comfortable answers, but they're the right questions. And asking them, despite the pressure not to, despite the ridicule and dismissal, despite the algorithms and fact-checkers and institutional gatekeepers, that's how truth eventually emerges. Keep questioning, keep investigating, and never let anyone tell you that curiosity about the past is something to be ashamed of, because the past holds secrets. And some of those secrets are buried just beneath the surface, waiting for enough people to care enough to dig them up. The buildings are still standing. The maps still exist. The truth is still buried under our feet. All that's missing is enough people willing to look.